Welcome to Behind the Advice, the podcast for Australians living abroad who want to maximise their financial situation. I'm your host, Mitchell Kelsey, a financial advisor at Runway Wealth Management, and in each episode, I'll be sitting down with other experts and professionals to get their insights, stories, and expertise on key concepts for Australian expats, as well as providing my own perspective. With this being a financial podcast, there is a disclaimer, so any information that you hear in today's episode is general information only. It is not personal advice, so it does not take into account your personal situation, goals, or objectives. If you do need personal advice, feel free to reach out to us at Runway Wealth Management for personal financial advice. Welcome back to the Behind the Advice podcast. Today, we're diving into superannuation and retirement planning for Australians at home and abroad. We'll start with the basics of superannuation, then move into some more advanced strategies that can make a meaningful difference to your long-term retirement outcomes. Joining me today is financial advisor Adam Bolton from Bolton Financial Services. Adam works closely with clients on super and retirement strategy, so I'm really looking forward to getting his insights today. Adam, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back, Mitch.
Great to have you. So Adam, can you give us a bit of a background on the types of clients that you work with?
I work with quite a wide range of different clients, but regardless of whether we're talking about from a wealth perspective or whatever, the end game is always around retirement and providing, wealth strategies for income or the likes for later in life. So most of what we do focuses around that, even when we think about stuff like family trusts and stuff like that, where there's certainly some succession planning elements to that. Ultimately, there is still parts of that even fall into that. Well, how do we best structure that tax-wise and income-wise for later in life or into retirement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the topic today is superannuation and retirement planning. So on that note, what are some common retirement planning concerns that you see from Australians today?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mitch. And you know what? Most clients, it falls into sort of one of two things. It is having enough money to live on in terms of income-wise in retirement, and also making sure they have enough money and assets to support that, either heading into retirement and then through retirement, and even to the back end of that. There's also often discussions around making sure that there's sufficient asset base in case of things like aged care or things like that. But ultimately, falls down to, will I have enough money, and is it going to last me long enough?
Absolutely, and that's what I'm seeing as well. Do we have enough to retire? So that's a really common, concern that we hear from Australians. So why is superannuation still such a central part of retirement planning?
I suppose there's a couple of different reasons for that. And part of that is the restrictions around the access to it. So during what we call our accumulation phase, so that's generally through our working lives from, 16, 18, whatever, right through to sort of 60, 65, 67, depending on what benchmarks you want to look at there. The ability to access those funds is very limited. So that's an important thing because it's forced savings in a way. And then there's the combination of things of the tax treatment of our superannuation savings in that accumulation phase, but then also once we do retire and we start our pension phase, the tax benefits of holding our assets inside of there are even more powerful again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for Australian expats listening on the call, typically when you move overseas, you work for an overseas employer, you're not likely receiving your super guarantee contributions from an Australian employer. It's not required usually for your overseas employer to be making those contributions. So you really want to have some kind of alternative that is kind of acting as superannuation, or alternatively, if it works for your circumstances, you're still contributing to super personally. So I think let's kind of start from the basics. So looking at some of the fundamentals of superannuation. So starting simple, how would you explain superannuation and its purpose, just in real simple terms?
So it's like we touched on, it's a saving system to provide for income in our retirement. So once we stop our working life, we've still got to pay the bills. The superannuation system provides us a means in order to help build that investment, build that savings to provide for that ability to draw income once we hang it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is governed by, the Australian tax laws. Essentially, the basis for superannuation is to reduce dependency on government incentives or government benefits later in life. So the government has kind of structured it in a way that encourages contributing to this superannuation system to help be self-funded in retirement. So with that, there are a number of benefits of adding money to your Australian superannuation, but there are some considerations or caveats with making contributions as well. So what are some of the key components that people should understand when it comes to superannuation?
Yeah, so when we think about our superannuation funds, there's a couple of different things to take into consideration there. So the first part is, I guess, what type of account that you have. The overwhelming majority of us will have accumulation accounts, and like the name suggests, it's accumulating savings for our retirement. Then within those funds, we've got our investment options to choose from for where we have our money invested to help grow it for the long term. And then we sort of get down to the nitty gritty there of, are there insurances involved around life insurance, income protection, stuff like that? And then even further down, a bit later on in things, we've got the components around the taxable and tax-free components, which helps with succession planning, estate planning, stuff like that. And then we have our preservation status, which is, are the funds preserved or unpreserved, to keep it simple. To dial it down even simpler, I guess, is until you reach 60 and commence pension phase, those funds are restricted. That meaning you can't just ring up your super fund and withdraw it unless you meet certain conditions of release. But prior to age of 60, they're pretty serious conditions of release. One of them is passing away. So at that point, it's probably not much good to you anyway.
Yeah, sure. And I think just as you said, just kind of summing up, breaking down those components, you've got contributions going in. So there's various contributions that we can make to our superannuation funds. And we'll get into the nuances of the different types of contributions later on in the podcast. You've also got the tax that you pay within superannuation. So typically the maximum tax rate within superannuation that you'll pay on your investment earnings is 15%. It can be as low as 0% if you're retired and starting to draw some money out of your superannuation. But typically 15% is the maximum tax rate. So if you compare that, I guess for an Australian resident, if you compare that to your top marginal tax rate here in Australia, if you're investing outside of super, it could be up to 47%. So it really encourages you to invest through super because of that tax effective environment. And then lastly, you've got the preservation rules. As you alluded to before, superannuation is preserved. We must meet a condition of release before we can access superannuation. They're very limited. It's not something you can access quite easily. There was that period through COVID-19 where there was the government allowed you to take out 10,000 over 2 financial years. That was quite unique. I dare say we won't be seeing anything like that.
We will not see that again
anytime soon. But certainly in most cases, you need to be over the age of 60 and retired. Failing that, at age 65 is typically when you can access your Australian superannuation funds.
Yeah.
So I think, transitioning from there, how does investing in super compare to investing outside of super?
There's a lot of similarities in a way, but also there's some differences as well. And one of the key things there is around timeline of investment. And often there's some misnomers around that as well in terms of the general consensus, or it seems to be there's people that, okay, well, I am, say, 55, I want to retire at 60. That's a 5-year investment window. Well, very rare when we hit that age 60, we're just going to withdraw all your money out of super. It would not make any sense to take a large chunk of money from a tax-free or a tax-sufficient environment into a personal name where even in a bank earning interest, you're getting taxed at your marginal rate. So realistically, the investment timeline is much longer than that, and reasonable health allowing and things like that. The timeline of investment is usually much longer than that. We're like, well, okay, we want to retire at 60, but gee, we hope we're around for another 25 or 30 years after that. So we utilise that as a benchmark. Now, we may not be quite as aggressive as we would be in our 30s or 40s with that sort of timeline, but we still consider that as part of our foundation for how we invest, because we want the money to be working for us and we want it to be generating solid returns for us to either sustain the viability of the fund longer, or even help it grow, depending on your balance. So that's one element, but then also the tax efficient nature of the superannuation system, both in accumulation and in pension phase, can also help with the way that we invest, because we're a little bit still mindful of things like capital gains in accumulation and even income, but at the same time, we are probably less concerned about it because of the tax treatment of that versus in our personal names or even in a family trust environment. The tax treatment is different. So then, we're far more mindful of that. Not more mindful, still mindful of it, but we're more concerned about it.
Yeah, definitely. I think you summed it up really nicely at the start there in terms of comparing investing in super versus outside of super. It's very much the same, but there are differences there in terms of the tax treatment and accessibility. So I think there can sometimes be some confusion around superannuation being an investment itself, whereas superannuation is merely just a tax vehicle for the most part. You can invest in the exact same assets within your superannuation fund as you can investing outside of super. There are just those rules and regulations that superannuation is subject to that govern the tax treatment and the accessibility rules.
Yes.
So I think if we change gears now and start to look at contributions to super. So what are the main ways that Australians can contribute to their superannuation funds?
Yeah, okay. So there's two main ways to contribute to your superannuation. So the first one being concessional contributions, which is pre-tax money. So that's generally your employer contributions, salary sacrifice, personal contributions you're planning to claim a tax deduction on. Now, just on that one, I think the misconception there is that's just something that sole traders or self-employed do. Certainly very popular for tax planning for them, but also as individuals, we can still do that as well. And then the second part is non-concessional contribution. So that's from after-tax money. So the amount we can put in there is higher, but it's purely coming from savings or inheritance or asset sales or something of your own, and then putting that into super where we can't claim the tax deduction or there's no immediate personal tax benefits to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really good summation in terms of the contribution types, concessional and non-concessional. I mean, you've got a few other more unique contributions as well, such as the downsizer contribution. Yes. This is typically when you've sold your home that you've owned for more than 10 years. You can contribute that, a sum of up to 300,000 into your Australian superannuation fund. But broadly speaking, most contributions are going to fall into either concessional or non-concessional. Do you want to just give a quick summary in terms of what those caps are? So what the limits are in terms of for each of those contribution types?
Yeah, so for the concessional contribution, so our from pre-tax money, the current cap on that is $30,000 per year. But what we need to be mindful of there is that includes our employer contributions and any salary sacrifice we're doing. So if our employer's putting in $10,000 a year and we are salary sacrificing $5,000 a year, well, it doesn't mean we can put 30 on top of that. There are certain circumstances that we may or may not discuss later on where that can be allowed, but for the general rule, that 15,000 that's already gone in means we have another 15 we can put in. Then with the non-concessional contributions under current rules, it's 120,000 per year we can put in. And again, there's certain rules that you can potentially do more than that. But again, there's pros and cons to that, but then also there's a bunch of, conditions you have to meet before you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into some of those, more advanced strategies where you can contribute more than those single financial year contribution caps. I mean, what are some of the common mistakes that you see people make when contributing to super?
Yeah, there's quite a few actually, but we'll keep it to sort of the main ones. So one of the biggest ones is, as we're heading towards retirement and we're discussing retirement planning, is people that are assuming that there's a bunch of loopholes and ways and means we can just chuck huge amounts of money in just prior to retirement. And we're talking, all right, I'm 63, I want to retire in 12 months, but I have $1 million. I want to try and get into super before I retire. Well, unfortunately, that's not going to be possible. So often we need to start that strategy and start planning that further in advance. So that's the biggest one is people underestimating the timeline and the requirements around those contribution rules about how to get money in. So that's the first one. Second one is people breaching their concessional cap. Mm-hmm. So that 30,000 rule, because they've used ChatGPT and it's told them that they can put 100 grand or 120,000 in and so they put a big chunk in, and it turns out that's not correct. And that's there's a saying that an advisor you and I both know very well used to say that he said superannuation is like the mafia, once in, never out. So that's a similar thing where someone might put a big chunk of money in, and then after the fact come to us and go, oh, so I've already done this, and it's like, okay, right, because there are penalties involved with that. So they're probably the two biggest mistakes, and probably the third one then as well is doesn't happen as much anymore, where people have put money into super thinking it was a good way to put savings or do whatever, thinking it was going to be easy to get out. And like, again, it's no, sorry, that's stuck there till age 60 or whatever. So they're probably the biggest mistakes that we sort of come across.
Yeah. Yeah, not much more I would add to that. I have been asked in the past, or have had it suggested to me, whether it makes sense to make a contribution to two different super funds and whether there be two different contribution caps applying. Certainly not the case. It works on a per person basis, not a per super fund basis. That may seem like a silly thing to think about, but I've been asked by that. So
it's a good point. Also, the spousal split rule, where people go, oh, I can put money into my super and split it over to my partner, and they think that that's a way they can put more into super and then split the extra over to their spouse, thinking that counts against their cap. And yeah, that's not the rule. If you put 30,000 in yourself and then you split 10,000 over to your spouse, that 30,000 counts against your cap. Regardless, the 10,000 going to your spouse is essentially a gift. So, yeah. But I've certainly come across that before. It's like, oh, I put X amount in, but because I'm splitting X amount to my partner, I assumed that we could do that. And it's like, no, sorry. So,
yeah. Absolutely. And we talked about investing through superannuation earlier and how it's very much the same as investing outside of super. So when it comes to superannuation, how should people be thinking about investing their superannuation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mitch. So in terms of how we invest our superannuation, it sort of goes back to the investment portfolio stuff we talked about on a previous episode, where we talk about diversification is really, really important. Sometimes in certain superannuation structures, people get caught up with a single type of asset class that they really want to be invested in, and that's all they want to invest in, or you're still carrying that same risk as you do investing elsewhere. So diversification is really important. Liquidity concern, depending on the point of life you're at. If you're in retirement, liquidity of your investments is really, really important. But prior to that, it's maybe slightly less important. And then your risk profile. So your risk profile around that timeline of investment of how much growth exposure and how much defensive exposure do we want? And then also within that, if we go to the pension side of things, the requirement for our assets in there to be generating us free flow income, which can then be paid to us in our pension payments. Generally at that point, it's a little bit more important at that stage versus when we're in accumulation. Probably less concerned about the income generation because that's just getting reinvested anyway.
Yeah, definitely. I think you summed it up nicely in terms of it really comes down to your life stage, and ultimately that determines your investment time horizon.
Yes. And
then also your risk profile. So your appetite for taking on market volatility or market risk. Certainly if you're a lot younger, kind of still in the accumulation phase, you typically want to take on a little bit more risk because you've got that inherent long-term investment time horizon. So if you're 30, you can't access your super until at least age 60.
Yep.
You've got that 30-year time horizon where you can really ride out the ups and downs of the market cycle, the economic cycle.
And that's something, I don't know about yourself, but I'm very open with people. It's like, yeah, you got 30 or 35 years before you're able to access your super. The discussions that we have there is like, over that time, you are going to see multiple significant market events that we will ride through together. We've seen how the market reacts over time with those events. It's not a case of if, but when. But we've got time on our side to navigate through those, and we're looking at the bigger picture. But then on the other side, in terms of that, as we hit retirement and hit pension phase, the narrative of, well, we have to be super conservative because of that. Well, not necessarily. As we continue down that path and as we get older or health changes or stuff like that, we can certainly do that. Now, it'd be hard-pressed to recommend someone says high growth at 65 or 67. I've certainly got clients who insist on that, and that's okay. Their financial literacy is excellent. But yeah, it doesn't. That's a misconception, I guess, is, we now have to go all into cash and just hope it lasts as long as it does. No, we can find a balance in the middle there somewhere, depending on what they're looking, what the client's looking to do and the timeline and age and stuff, where we can still be having that money work for us.
Yeah, definitely. So certainly as you approach closer to retirement and certainly into retirement, the investment approach kind of changes from all growth to more capital preservation, income generation. That's kind of how we think about shifting, I guess, the underlying strategy of investments for our superannuation. So, I mean, we've talked about investing through super, and then, you can also invest outside of super. So how should people kind of, in a broad sense, how should people think about the balance between investing in super and investing outside of super?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mitch. So when we look at that, one of the big factors there is around liquidity or need for those funds. So if there's a situation where and there's a million reasons why you may need access to funds or partial access to funds, then maintaining those investments outside of super is important, because once it's in there, we can't get it back out again, minus the conditions that we spoke about previously. So that's a really, really important factor. So if somebody comes to us and goes, I've got these funds that are from inheritance or an asset sale or whatever, need to park them for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, but hey, we may look to invest in a business, or we may look to buy another property or whatever. Well, there's a clear potential need for those funds. So therefore, investing in outside of super would be the prudent move, and then finding the right structure to do that. Versus if there's a balance between, well, we may need some, but whatever, or there's some tax considerations or capital gains we need to sort of look at here, that's where investing inside of super can make a lot of sense. So it's about finding that balance, and also, I suppose, the age you're at as well. I've got a client at the moment who I'm just onboarding. He's just sold a significant asset. We need to use super a bunch to manage some tax positions there. He's also 57, so he's only got 3 years till he hits age 60. He's retired now. So in terms of with him, it's about finding that split of getting money into super because it's more tax efficient. We know he's only got 3 years till he can actually access it, but he's already retired now. So we need assets outside of super to be structured correctly to create income for him now. But we're using that balance at the moment, and without giving sort of any specifics, we're putting a good chunk into super and utilising those cap rules now while we've got 3 years ahead of us, which is an important number. But then also making sure that those other assets are structured correctly outside to provide him income for now, while the assets in super are growing and building for once he hits 60.
Yeah, it really seems it's a typical kind of trade-off between tax benefits and accessibility or liquidity, as you referred to it. And I think just kind of putting an Australian expat lens on that, when you're living overseas, the tax treatment when you're investing outside of super is quite different to someone that's living in Australia as a resident for tax purposes. So in that case, it in some instances, it may be more suitable from both a tax perspective and an accessibility standpoint to be investing outside of super. And then additionally, for Australian expats, there may be a case where you may not be planning on returning to Australia for retirement. So if you're not sure if Australia is going to be home through retirement, there may be some alternative kind of retirement assets that you want to be building up in anticipation of that. So that's kind of another nuance for an Australian expat listening to today's podcast. So Adam, you mentioned, as you approach closer to retirement, that's when I guess the trade-off between investing through super or outside super gets a little bit more nuanced. So when does it kind of make sense to prioritize investing through super or outside of super?
Yeah. So as you said, we're getting towards, I suppose, understanding, I guess, what the retirement goal is. Mm-hmm. Are we looking to retire prior to 60? Okay, well, because of that accessibility scenario to super, we need to make sure we've got adequate assets structured in a way which creates income personally prior to that. Is it 60? Okay, well, then we focus on trying to get those assets into super because it's more tax efficient for the long run. Is it 65 because of a combination of our balance, the way our current assets are structured, or where our equity is tied up, e.g. if it's a property's very good place, to build equity and build your capital, not liquid. So really tricky for us to unlock that and without selling the asset, and that can take time. And there's also other tax considerations there. Or then is it later on, or there's scenarios where some people are like, I don't think I'll ever fully retire or don't really plan to. So that is the first point, is to understand where those key dates lie. And then it's about reviewing what ability we have to put additional funds into super and how we do that. Sometimes it might be quite a long strategy that we need to undertake because we're putting smaller amounts in over a longer period, or we have other assets that we may need or want to dispose of in preparation for that. Well, what do they look like? What's the tax treatment going to look like when we do sell them? Because usually the government's going to have their hand out as well, so we want to manage that. And then also working within those contribution rules we have about making sure we've got really strong strategies there to ensure we maximise what we can get in over that timeline to best prepare ourselves. So come 55, 60, 65, 67, whatever that looks like, we're ready to go.
Yeah, definitely. Some really good points there. I think we touched on it before. The trade-off to investing through super or outside super comes down to the tax benefits of either option, but also the accessibility piece. Yep. So certainly naturally later on in life when you can access your super. So for example, if you're retired and over the age of 60 or you're age 65, you're essentially just removing that accessibility as a consideration. So you can access your super. So it's a bit of a no-brainer to try and look to skew a lot of your wealth into the superannuation environment. The catch-22 there is usually if you're waiting until that long to put everything into super, there are some rules and regulations in terms of how much you can contribute. Your age can sometimes play a role in how much you can contribute. So you want to kind of strike a balance where you've still been contributing, leading up to that time of your life as well.
It's an excellent point you make there, Mitch, is around the age and what you can get into super, because there's also a somewhat common, I guess, oversight we do come across from clients is the assumption of, well, after 60, I can still put money into super, which is correct. Absolutely, you can. But as we start to get towards 70 and 75 and stuff like that, the rules start to change about what type of contributions we can still make and how much we can get in, and even the hard cap of no more can go in. And that's something that a lot of people aren't aware of. And so often we have situations where we need that timeline. We need 6, 7, 10 years to try and help people move their assets and get that into super and manage that process. And they're coming to us at 70. And it's like, okay, we're pretty limited to what we can do here. We can still do stuff and we can still structure those things and help with that tax efficiency, but it does, that number, that 75 hard cutoff, it does make it trickier for us for what we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably a really good segue to kind of ask you the question in terms of your thoughts. When is a good time to start seriously thinking about retirement planning?
Anytime.
I'd agree.
Yeah, I've got a 22-year-old that I'm onboarding at the moment as a client, the son of an existing client. He's already talking to me about, should I just salary sacrifice like $50 a fortnight into my super? And, it's like, great that he's already thinking about that. It's brilliant. But yeah, the sooner you start, I guess the more flexibility it provides you later on, or less, I guess, scrambling we may have to do come 60 or 65 to try and move and shake assets. But also, I don't want to say it's not too late, because we've just given examples of when it can be too late. But also, there's also not necessarily the case of you're 55 or you're 60 and you go, I've worked for myself all my life, I've got bugger all in super and now I'm kind of screwed. That's not necessarily the case either. There's still stuff we can do within that scenario as well. But the sooner we start, the better. And then if we get into those good habits early of making those additional contributions, then as we go down the path and as life changes, we may need to dial those back. We then may want to increase them. And there's certain, I think, key points where increasing those can make some sense. So where we have pay increases or go to higher tax brackets, certainly some strategies we can look at there. And then also in terms of, I think something that's not sort of considered a lot in this space is around starting a family or having children. So, because kids are expensive.
No doubt.
And guess what? The more you have of them, they don't get any cheaper. So there's times where you may want to dial that back because of other priorities. But then as the kids get older and start to leave the nest, then that frees up more household budget and cash flow where we can sort of I guess, ramp things up a little bit or alter our strategies there to either make up for lost time or to help accelerate our retirement planning strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would agree, kind of the sooner the better from a retirement planning standpoint. I think just naturally as life goes on, you've got more capacity to really start thinking about retirement later in life when you're in your peak income earning years as well. So that's naturally going to feed into it as well. So I think, when we think about a retirement plan, what does a good retirement plan look like? If we think about this in the context that, someone has just retired, they've got super, what is that? What does a good retirement look like in that point in time?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I suppose in the lead up to that point or at that point, if there's any additional contributions or any extra sort of funds that we want to source from different areas to put in, we sort of try and get those in at that point. And again, that's because of the tax efficiency, because from that point we then start pension phase. We start drawing our income for our clients. And so when we're in pension phase, for the overwhelming part of it, capital gains is tax-free. Income, distributions, dividends, stuff like that inside the fund are tax-free as well. So that's a really, really powerful tool. And then the income being paid out to the client is also tax-free. Whereas, and that's when, all your life you earn income, you make money, whether it's through your own business or whether it's through being as an employee, and you're paying tax. Yeah. So that's something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of is in retirement. They're like, well, we probably need $80,000 a year to live on in retirement. And you're like, oh, so is that pre-tax or after tax? And they're like, oh, no, that's pre-tax money. It's like, okay, well, then you sort of do the maths on that and go, well, that's about 60-odd thousand. Okay, well, that's what the number is that we need to aim for because coming from super, that's tax-free. So when we have that discussion with people, sometimes that's actually a bit of a relief to them because they're like, oh, we don't need to draw as much as we thought because of that tax situation. So that's the really key part. So is ensuring that in terms of how we have those discussions in the lead up to that, we have the education discussion around that tax treatment and then start, talking about, I guess, the living costs or the money that we want for retirement living is being in that post-tax money, after-tax money sort of discussion because that's essentially, we're living in a tax-free world within reason with it from the super pension after that. Yeah,
definitely. And I think just to add to that in terms of what a good retirement plan looks like, as you're approaching closer to retirement, typically we want to lower our expenses. We want to lower limit our expenses, not saying we have to live, super frugally or anything like that. Limit our expenses, probably pay down debt. So limit our debt obligations. We want to maximize income and kind of tax effective income. So typically there's going to be certain assets that are suitable for deriving an income in retirement. That's where things like shares are really helpful. Bonds, fixed income instruments, these kinds of assets are really great for providing us with an income in retirement because as we touched on earlier, we typically want to focus on income generation as opposed to growth or capital growth. We still want some exposure to capital growth naturally, but income really becomes the focus. I think property can sometimes fall into that mix of providing an income. As we know, Australian rental or Australian residential property has been fantastic from a growth standpoint. It doesn't typically provide a really good rate of return from an income yield. You're kind of lucky to get 1 to 3% from a rental yield, and if that property is held outside of super, you still got to pay tax on that as well. So I think from a good retirement plan standpoint, I think focusing on those assets that are going to provide a good income yield and a tax effective.
And I think something you touched on there, Mitch, as well, is some of those income producing assets that we can invest in retirement. Not only helps with providing guaranteed income, and we know what we're getting there, but some of those assets, some of those instruments also can be quite efficient when it comes to Centrelink asset test rules, which then sometimes can be the difference between people being ineligible for the age pension versus how those assets are tested by Centrelink means that then we can get them under that threshold. Now, it's not about the income necessarily there, because if we're getting you just under that threshold in a legal sense, you're not getting much in terms of the pension. You're getting bugger all. And that's not what the focus is, but where the power comes from that is around the healthcare benefits and other discounts that you get. So electricity's cheaper, rates, other bits and pieces, insurances, prescription medication, doctor's visits, all that sort of stuff becomes significantly cheaper with those cards. So that's what we're really aiming for, because that helps reduce our expenses or our cost of living, which then helps with the other income generation strategies we've got in place to go a little bit further for you, because some of those factored in, budgeted expenses now become a bit lower. So that's where the more important part of it is not from the physical income side of it. It's about the expenses that it helps us save, which then frees up more cash flow for our retirement living.
Yeah, absolutely. Those, Social Security should never be the goal, but if it is available, certainly we want to kind of maximize any kind of entitlement to those benefits in retirement. I wanted to ask you one more question before we kind of wrap up the discussion on retirement planning and move into some more, I guess, advanced super strategies. For someone, maybe 4 or 5 years out from retirement, how should they be kind of determining how much they need in retirement? How do you kind of go through that with your clients? Yeah,
it's a good question, Mitch. So we certainly look at, like you said, debt reduction is the first one. So how are we tracking with that, and what sort of repayments are we making on that at the moment, and what strategies we're using to pay those down? Now, assuming that we've got onto that early enough and that's on track, we sort of factor in, okay, well, there's, a fairly significant expense, particularly if we're talking about mortgages, that we can sort of factor into reducing that living expense scenario. Having a bit of a look over other things in terms of other living expenses and stuff like that, looking at other retirement goals we've got, like things like, is there travel? Is there other things we want to do? Is there any additional purchases we need to do prior to retirement, like new vehicles or anything like that? And then from there, we get a bit of an idea then through those discussions about what that sort of, I guess, estimated living amount is that we probably look for. And then we start doing the modelling from there to see how we're tracking with that. And if we're not there yet, then we start visiting, okay, what other assets do we want to move into that environment? What extra contributions do we need to do on top of what we're probably already doing to help us prepare to get to that golden number, whatever that looks like. Every client's different. Yeah, it really just comes down to the basics. So, really refining, understanding your budget. So how much you need from living expenses to live the lifestyle that you want. So, whether that's using some kind of online budgeting platform, using Excel, kind of listing out all of your expenses in a given month and kind of extrapolating that over 12 months. And then, for us as advisors, we can then use that and kind of work backwards in terms of understanding how much in assets we need to produce that as an income for you into retirement. And it's not always going to be the case where you can kind of we can produce enough income. So there's going to be there may be some asset depletion over time. So your assets are going to be drawn down over time, but at least we can give you us as advisors can give you some context around what that looks like. So how long it's going to take before those assets are kind of fully depleted into retirement. Yeah. Let's move into some more, moving away from retirement planning and then just looking at some more advanced, superannuation strategies. So I think, we touched on concessional contributions, non-concessional contributions. You mentioned that there's the ability to contribute more than the contribution caps. Do you want to just provide a quick high level in terms of what those strategies look like for both concessional and non-concessional? Yeah, so from the concessional perspective, you do have the carry forward rule, which is where you can bring forward 5 years of unused pre-tax contribution caps. There's certain requirements around that. So as of July 1, the year that you plan to use it, your superannuation balance must be under $500,000. And then obviously you must have actually the balance there. So for that eligibility. So that's the first one. And then if we look at it from a non-concessional perspective, we then have our bring forward rule. So that's a scenario where we can put our 120,000 in, or under current rules, 120,000 in this year. But then we have the ability to carry forward 2 additional financial years worth of contribution cap. So under current rules, we can put up to 360 in within one rule, within 1 year. And of course, again, there's rules around like lifetime superannuation transfer caps and other rules like that that you have to meet as well. But to keep it simple, they're sort of the 2 main ones. Then, like you talked about before, we have the downsizer contributions, and we also have things like CGT relief contributions. But again, there's a bunch of rules and conditions you have to meet around those. So usually that's guided by your accountant or your advisor around whether that's you're eligible for those type of more detailed contributions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think looking at the carry forward concessional contribution rules, this is still relatively new. I think it was legislated in 2019 or even 2018, but it could only be used or being started to be used in 2019. So I think it's really underrated and I guess underutilized. And I think particularly from, when I'm working with my clients, people living overseas, Australian expats, they typically haven't contributed to their super over the last 5 years. So you've got a heap of unused concessional contributions that you could kind of carry forward into a current financial year. And that can be so powerful if you've recently sold a property or you have some other kind of tax events where you're looking to offset some of that taxable income in Australia. I was doing some of the numbers for a client recently. So effective 1 July next year, so the contribution caps will increase. Yep. And you can get up to 175,000 as a concessional contribution into super that you could claim as a tax deduction.
Yeah.
So that's huge. And then I think with the non-concessional contributions and utilizing the bring forward rule, this is fantastic in terms of if you haven't contributed to super for a long time and you're kind of approaching retirement, it gives you ample space, ample kind of cap to kind of catch up and move a lot of your assets into superannuation. And you can be really strategic with that as well. So you might contribute, the maximum single financial year contribution in June. So you might do 120, and then the next financial year you could do 360. So that kind of gives you up to 480 over the course of 2 months. So that's where strategy can really help kind of get the maximum into the superannuation environment.
Yeah, exactly right, Mitch. And I think from what you're mentioning about like that carry forward thing, particularly for expats that are overseas and haven't contributed to super for quite some time, if they've got assets here, which quite often is property or quite substantial sort of investment portfolios or whatever they might be liquidating or moving for whatever reason, having that ability to do that, particularly given those non-resident tax rates, can be a really, really powerful tool. And certainly, correct me if I'm wrong, depending on where you live overseas, there's even potentially then under double taxation agreements, the ability for that to help you as well. So I think that's a really, really important point.
Absolutely.
Having that available to non-residents.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this next question that I'm going to ask you might sound a little bit self-serving, but I think certainly there's so many eligibility requirements when it comes to utilizing these strategies, these more advanced strategies that we've talked about, the bring forward rule, the carry forward rules. So how important is getting advice when you're implementing these strategies?
Well, you're right. It is a bit self-serving. In the old stockbroking days, we call this talking up our own book. But no, it is really important because some of these strategies you've talked about, there's eligibility criteria, and some of them are quite detailed and ifs, buts, and maybes, and things like that. So, it's important to have a professional look at that for you and make sure, one, your eligibility is correct, but then two, is also particularly that end of financial year, start of financial year timing matter like you talked about. Yeah. Particularly getting this time of year, very, very common that we go, right, let's do the 120 for this year for, say, the non-concessional, and then let's do 360 July 1st. And so now we've got 480 into super instead of 360. I've got 2 different clients right now that we are doing that 120 in the coming days. And then first week of July, we'll be putting the remainder in again because they meet the requirements in order to do that. But again, that's getting more of their cash into that tax efficient superannuation environment because they're both essentially retired, getting ready to start that income stream.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for Australian expats, there can be a bit of a misconception around whether you can contribute to superannuation. So it certainly is something that is available to you. It's certainly not prohibited. There can be some concerns around, whether that's going to impact on your tax residency status. Highly unlikely to carry a significant weight in kind of changing your tax residency status. So these strategies are available to Australian expats. So something to really consider if you're an Australian expat, kind of considering, some of these circumstances may be relevant to you. Obviously seeking some advice because of the the complexities when implementing them.
I think it's important. Sorry, I think it's important on that as well, Mitch, for those watching, particularly those that are overseas. It's really important that you are seeking the advice from an advisor, someone like Mitch, who specialises in expat advice and those rules. Like, come and see me. I haven't worked in that space for a long time. I'm not completely across the rules. I'm going to refer you straight to Mitch, because for me, it's like, well, I'm not going to pretend to be what I'm not. So I think that's really, really important, that when you speak to an advisor about this, just getting a really good understanding of what their exposure and what their client base looks like in terms of that expat advice. Because if it's not something that they're doing full time, or they just dabble in, or I've got a couple of clients that live overseas, maybe not the person for you. It's really, really important that you seek, if you've got a specific situation like you are living overseas, you're an Australian expat, that you see somebody that's what they live and breathe. So someone like Mitch is really important to engage, versus, you might have an advisor in Australia that you worked with years ago when you did live here. But how intricately are they keeping up with that expat space? Because the rules are always changing there. So, yeah, I think that's an important point as well.
Yeah, and you're right. The rules do change so quickly, so fast, like from one financial year to the next. So certainly something where we're kind of constantly having to catch up on and kind of stay at the forefront of. But
it does feel like as well in that space that from what I see of it, like, okay, you've got to keep up with the same regulatory changes that we do in terms of superannuation and tax and this and that. But we generally get some lead time to sort of digest it and whatever else. But it does feel, at least from my perspective, when I see changes to expat rules around certain asset classes or tax or whatever, it seems like it gets announced and it's being implemented extraordinarily fast, much faster than the stuff that we have to keep across as it is. So that's why I sort of noted that it's really important to see someone who specialises in this space, because of how dynamic the rules are around that with the ATO. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll kind of we'll go through one more kind of segment around, some misunderstandings around super. So what's probably one thing that you see Australians typically misunderstand about superannuation?
I think the biggest one is probably the lack of understanding about how it works for the bigger picture. A lot of people, sort of talk about we don't believe in super, and the reason for it is, well, it's my money and I can't access it. And it's like, okay, well, one, it's a forced savings, so that's a good thing. But the tax efficiency and the reasons why, and particularly both now or heading into retirement or at retirement, trying to maximise getting those assets in, and I'm sure you'd be able to attest to this, the number of clients who have that view, and then something in life changes where suddenly they're like, no, wait a minute, I need to get more in, or how do I do this and that and whatever else in terms of getting more money into super. And it's like, yeah, that's probably the biggest misconception is the education and understanding around why superannuation is important, both from an income generation perspective, but also from a tax efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, definitely. And I think people are right to be maybe a little bit concerned about the rules regularly changing. So, previous governments, existing governments, they're constantly tinkering with the superannuation rules. Is it too tax advantaged? Are we not incentivizing superannuation enough? They're constantly kind of going back and forth between those two motivations. So you're right to kind of have some reservations from time to time. But I think the more that you can get familiar with the rules and really understand the benefits, the more you can kind of really make it work for your circumstances, particularly around pension phase. I think not a lot of people fully comprehend how powerful pension phase is. And just for clarity, pension phase is essentially once you've retired and you start drawing a regular income from your superannuation. In that environment, as you said earlier, Adam, capital gains, tax-free, income generated in the superannuation fund, tax-free. And if you're over the age of 60, the withdrawals are tax-free. Yeah. Like, it doesn't really get much better than that. They've changed the rules to some extent in terms of limiting how much can be moved into that pension phase or retirement phase. But I think it's currently 2.1 million. So there's still a fair bit of room there to kind of work with.
Yeah, and I think you're right with that, Mitch, in terms of, that's another area as well in terms of misconceptions. I think people think your superannuation is a forced savings that once you retire, you get it paid to you, and then you're sticking it in the bank account, earning as best interest rate as you can, and that's what you have to live on, which is where the importance of seeking good advice, both in the lead-in and post-retirement, is important, because, like we've already said, that's very rarely the case, minus a few like outlier scenarios. That's not the case at all. It's starting that pension phase and still having that money invested within your level of comfort to then help generate that income source ongoing. It's not just left for you to go, well, here's your chunk of money on the way out the door. Good luck with it. That's very rarely the case at all. And I suppose I hesitate to bring this up because I worry about overstepping the general advice disclaimer. When it comes to defined benefit superannuations, which is one we haven't talked about, I think for a reason, because there's not many of them around anymore, and they're only available in very limited scenarios. All I will say with that is, prior to retirement, it is imperative to get structured professional advice in your pre-retirement strategies, and also around the what's and how's your defined benefit account looks and what you're going to do with it, because there are some really significant pitfalls that can work against you and your family and your estate planning if you don't get that right. I think the only warning I can give on that, because anything else starts becoming outside of that general advice scenario. But yeah, that's a very, very complex product that I think, defined benefit providers try to make seem very easy. A lot of pitfalls though, and not easy to find the information about what those pitfalls are. So I think that probably wraps that up well enough on that topic. But yeah, it is probably one area I see the most after the fact sort of, I guess, mistakes made with, where people were like, I wasn't aware of this, or if I'd known that, I might have taken a different path. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think if you're wondering, do I have a defined benefit? I think if you have a defined benefit, you'll know. Yeah. You'll know. They're very rare. But yeah, as you said, seek advice on those, because they're very nuanced in terms of your options there. In terms of
I'm working on 3 at the moment with some level of pre-retirement or imminent retirement strategies. All 3 people were going to go down a particular path. And after having had fairly decent discussions and education points around the ins and outs and the pros and cons for the 3 options they have, all 3 are going a very different path now.
Yeah, absolutely. Just some rapid fire questions I'll ask you, Adam. If you could give one piece of advice about super, what would it be?
Start sooner and start small. Start sooner, even if you're starting small.
Yeah. I like that. I'll just go ahead and second that. What's something simple that people can do today to improve their superannuation position?
Probably 2 things. One, the first one, of even if you're young, small contributions early on compound significantly. And then the second one would be ensuring you're adequately invested for what your tolerance is and for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. I would second that. And also just say, if you're someone that's got multiple superannuation funds, just please look at consolidating them. There's no need to have, multiple, I'm talking more than, 3 or 4. Yep. Also be careful if you've got some insurance coverage within those superannuation funds. You want to be careful not to consolidate, lose some valuable insurance as part of that. But I mean, if you're someone that's got, 4 or 5 superannuation funds, there's really no need for that. There's some really easy ways that you can go about just consolidating those funds.
It's probably a misconception as well about you must have one fund. There are a number of strategies that we employ as advisors which can involve 2 or even 3 accounts, but that's around structured advice with a very clear or number of clear goals involved, which is why we need to do that. But yeah, when you see, I think the most I've seen is 11. The client came to me a number of years ago. I was like, oh dear. I think current tax rules or ATO rules around like abandoned funds and stuff like that makes that far less likely these days. But yeah, I agree with you, minus obviously that insurance discussion. If you've got insurances in multiple accounts, you definitely need to seek advice from a financial advisor or a specialist insurance advisor to make sure that you are adequately protected should you then consolidate those funds. So definitely look into that first before you start moving funds, because with those funds, once you consolidate them or move them and you close them, those insurances are gone and they're gone forever.
Yeah, absolutely. We might round out the discussion there, Adam. This has been super informative for our listeners, I'm sure. Really appreciate you jumping on the podcast again. I think this is your third appearance. Yep. So great to have you back on again. We'll definitely have you back on for some further episodes.
Thanks a lot, Mitch. It's been great.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you want to learn more about Runway Wealth Management and how we help Australian expats, feel free to jump onto our website, runwaywealth.com, and we're also on all the social media platforms.